del Sur. I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore the biggest challenges ahead in the country and in the region. In today's program, we take a look at the second round of the presidential election in Colombia. We look at the main contenders and their proposals for the country. We will also analyze how both candidates could handle the implementation of the peace deal with the FARC, who will defend it and who will let it die, and what consequences will this have for Latin America. How will it change the political panorama in the next years? To look at this, we have Fernando Casado, political analyst. But first, let's take a look at this video.
The presidential race in Colombia is growing more intense, as some polls show the left-wing candidate, Gustavo Petro, closing the gap on the front-runner, Iván Duque. According to the Latin American Strategic Center of Geopolitics, CELAG, the right-wing candidate's lead is down just to 5.5%. It puts Iván Duque on 45.5% and Gustavo Petro on 40%. As Colombia's presidential runoff draws closer, social movements remember the serious human rights violations that were committed under past governments.
During Uribe's time, there were more than 1,000 attacks on human rights activists, going from threats to murders.
Campesinos, indigenous people, and social leaders are concerned not only that Álvaro Uribe is behind the candidacy of Iván Duque, but also the endorsement of corrupt political groups.
Duque has brought together the traditional political class, and the most corrupt parties are not ashamed or publicly expressing their support for him. Duque has said publicly that he will intercede directly in the judicial process, and that he intends to eliminate the high courts.
Social movements and human rights activists hope the new president of Colombia will fight to prevent the violence from getting worse.
The worst thing that the country can do is to return to paramilitary groups taking over Colombia.
Just a week ago, the Supreme Court of Justice declared the massacres of San Roque, El Aro, and La Granja as crimes against humanity. Crimes in which Álvaro Uribe, who was the governor of Antioquia, is facing a preliminary investigation.
So thank you for being with us, Fernando. So we are days away from the runoff election in Colombia. Can you tell us a bit of your ideas on what the first round of elections was?
Well, thanks for having me. I would say that it's a very special moment in the Colombian politics. No? It's the first time since Gaitán, since late 40s, that a left-wing candidate passed to the second round. And that's it also in a turnout where very many Colombians went to vote, because normally the turnout is always below 50%, and this time was 53% the turnout. So that's also is probably low in a comparative level, but it's also something awkward for the Colombian politics. However, I would say that the ruling class, the establishment, is going to make it very difficult for Petro to win the presidency. And then we will probably see, not only because of the polls, but also because of the supports that he has managed to gather, that he has probably very little chances to really beat Iván Duque, who is the right-wing candidate, the puppet or even the protege of Uribe, and that also has all the support of the ruling class and the establishment.
So what were the proposals of both candidates, of Gustavo Petro and Iván Duque?
They are radically different. On the one hand, we have Petro's proposals in a country that is the third most unequal country in the world, a country where the GDP per capita is very low, it's almost $6,000. Where we have also a very big concentration of land in very few hands, like 0.5% of the lands have almost 70% of the land property. So what he's proposing is to curb what he has considered as a medieval or feudal situation where there are very low taxes in comparison also with the region. So he proposed, for example, the non-productive lands to put taxes on them, and if the owners do not want to pay these taxes, to give those lands to the state, and then the state will give it to the peasants without land. So that would be like an agricultural or agrarian revolution within Colombia. Also, he's against, for example, the oil fracking, what Duque supports. And that's also very interesting because he would like to diversify the economy in order not to depend only on oil or other not renewable resources. He wants to make sort of also a green revolution within Colombia. And in general, he wants to increase the taxes. Also, another very special feature of Petro, of course, is that he's going to support and try to consolidate the peace process. Whereas, on the other hand, Iván Duque wants to curb taxes for the business sectors and red tape, support oil fracking, and he's talking about changing, modifying the peace process and the terms of the treaty and the process in order to sort of put a setback in what has been done till now. So I would say that these are two very radical proposals, very radical in the sense that they are very different. One for the right, far right-wing party, Iván Duque, the puppet or protege of Uribe, and then on the other hand, Petro, with for the first time in half a century, that proposed a left-wing program.
And not even with the, not just the peace agreement with the FARC, but also in the negotiations with the ELN taking place right now in Cuba. Like, how do you see the future of those negotiations with either side, especially since Latin America has been declared a region of peace?
Yeah, well, a region of peace that maybe is going to be modified after Colombia gets into NATO. But going back to your question, probably with Iván Duque, we will see a stop in the negotiations and in the talks with the ELN. And with Petro, of course, we will see how the process goes forward. It has been also a very difficult and a slow process. ELN also, as FARC, when they were negotiating, there are many things that have to be discussed, like what's the future of the guerrilla members, how are they going to be introduced in the political, economic and social life of Colombia. So it's a very complicated process. I don't think that the perspective of Iván Duque, that has been the perspective of Centro Democrático and also Uribe in the last years, is to have the patience to sit down in La Habana, especially in that country, and negotiate with a group that is, according to them, narco-terrorist group. So it's probably going to, we will see how that process stops, probably a reverse in the process with FARC, with Iván Duque, and a complete different process with Petro.
But the peace negotiations weren't the only thing that were the main discussion during the elections. It was also the matter of Venezuela, which we've seen throughout many Latin American countries. It continues to be an issue during the elections.
Yeah, and it has been also, both topics has been used in order to instill in fear on the population, on the public opinion, in order to reject the candidacy of Petro. Venezuela, for example, they have tried to make a comparison between Venezuela and Petro's electoral program in order to convince the public opinion after representing a very manipulated image of Venezuela that Petro is going to turn Colombia into a Venezuela, no? Meaning Venezuela, authoritarianism, economical crisis, etc. So it also he has accused of being a guerrilla member, what is actually true, but Petro was one of the responsible of demobilizing the guerrilla M19. So, but what they want to install into the public opinion is that Petro is also a guerrilla member and that he will try to benefit the guerrillas and that he is going to take Colombia into a disastrous situation. So those are the accusations that are all the time throwing over Petro in order to instill in fear.
So who is Petro? We saw recent polls saying that he's about 5.5% points away from Duque in the last polls.
Yeah.
Who is this person that could be the next president of Colombia?
Well, I would say that Petro also, well, he has already been mayor of Bogota. He did a very successful period. Even if he was they tried to boycott also his term. Remember that he was even separated from his post. What was reversed afterwards, and I would say that Petro is a very interesting alternative. It's a very realistic alternative. He has the support of a large amount of Colombians, especially the youth, but also in the most educated sectors of the Colombian population, and he will probably be completely turned into what has been the political perspective and practice in Colombia during the last decades. In the sense that at the moment, as I said, Colombia is a very unequal country, a country where this elite has been ruling and has been benefiting from the administration of government politics and economics, and the situation perhaps is right now unsustainable for a long term. That is why Petro has emerged as an alternative, very awkward for Colombian politics. In that sense, I think that he will try to put some order or egalitarian policies and social investment in a country that, as I said, has paid very little attention to the needs of the majority. And in that sense, I think that Petro, with a long distance with other political processes like Bolivia, Ecuador, or Venezuela, will be in that way, in a way. In the sense that he will make a government for the marginal majorities who has never been taken care.
So I want to analyze a bit more about Petro and his candidacy. He is the left alternative, but he couldn't get the support of other left-wing politicians. We had De La Calle and Fajardo getting a lot of votes, even closer to him, about 20% closest to Petro on the first round, but then he couldn't get their support to unify one left candidate.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because what Petro has said is that if Sergio Fajardo, who got around 20% of the final turnout, he would have immediately support him, and in order to transfer his votes to his candidacy, if he would have make it for the second round. However, Sergio Fajardo didn't do the same, and that's as also Petro has defined it, very responsible, because Fajardo has a rank in voters that come from center or even right center to the center left. And many leftist movements like Polo Democrático supported him. What now we cannot understand is why didn't Fajardo support Petro. Overall, because those three candidates you have mentioned from the first round, Humberto Lacalle, Sergio Fajardo, and Gustavo Petro, altogether amount 51% of the total amount of votes, and that's enough to beat in the second round Iván Duque. It seems that in the end, also the elite and the ruling class interest has forced Fajardo not to make a movement towards Petro. And even if there could be ideological similarity, or Sergio Fajardo is closer to Petro in his electoral program and from an ideological point of view, he would prefer to stop Petro from being president and end up with a right radical wing party that will curb and will reverse many things that has been done in the last years with Juan Manuel Santos, and that Sergio Fajardo will disagree with. So that's why I agree with Petro when he says that he has been very responsible. The decision of not supporting him by Sergio Fajardo and also Humberto Lacalle, because probably that movement will prevent him from winning the elections and will put in the presidency of Colombia a right-wing politician that will jeopardize and will be really bad for the next years in Colombia. Even more, what Petro assures is that the presidency of Iván Duque will lead Colombia into dictatorship, because once the Uribismo will grasp power once again, they will never let it go.
So if we base our analysis on the first round, about 56% of voter turnout, we expect about the same to be on that second round, on that round of election on Sunday. But we also had allegations of fraud during the first round. That Juan Manuel Santos, the president of Colombia, said this was one of the most safest elections in the history of Colombia, but it was also the one that had the most allegations of fraud.
Yeah, it's true. The expectation is that around 53% also will be the turnout in the second round. And those irregularities actually try to put Fajardo in the second place and take out of the presidential race Gustavo Petro. We'll see what happens in the second round, because these allegations are really, really dangerous, especially when the results are very close. And we are expecting also that scenario, where probably the differences between Iván Duque and Gustavo Petro are going to be very, very little. The last polls also reflect that Petro is increasing the number of supports and is increasing the probabilities of...
Would that be enough for, in a couple of days, to win the presidency?
That's what we don't know, because imagine, in the last referendum related to the peace process, all the polls assured that the yes was going to win.
Yes.
And people were discussing if it was going to be over 55%, over 60%, but finally the no won.
The no won, yes.
Because there was a hidden vote that polls could not expect. So the same thing could happen in these elections. Maybe the polls are reflecting that Iván Duque is going to win the presidency, but you can never assure that it's going to be finally the result. And many other scenarios can happen. So in this sense, I think that it's really, really important to try to supervise the whole process with observers and with witnesses in the elections, because that could make it be a change, in the sense that the result can be so close that those irregularities could change the final result and give, for example, to Duque the presidency when Petro probably wins the elections.
So let's look ahead. Either Duque or Petro wins. They still have to deal with one of the main issues affecting Colombia right now, which is the deaths of social leaders, the murders of social leaders and political leaders across the country.
Yeah, that's one of the issues right now in Colombia. Violence is still going on since decades, and especially in the rural areas, and nothing has been done so far to curb this situation. And also the increase of violence due to a complete, genuine and new process in Colombia. Normally the violence was because of inner reasons, guerrilla, paramilitarism, military, but now also you have the narco cartels from abroad, and that's something new, and violence is increasing dramatically, especially in the coast of the Atlantic and Pacific. So this is going to be an issue for both presidents, either Duque or Petro. We'll see how they try to tackle this issue, because probably what we will see with Duque is once again force or violence to combat violence. But we will have to look at if it's a selective use of violence, because guerrilla was combated very harsh by Uribe's government, whereas paramilitarism increased, even affecting politics, the so-called scandal of the paramilitarism, where many members of his political party were involved in paramilitary practices. So what is also, what I am afraid of is that he might, for example, try to again use violence and army power to combat the ELN, but leave the narco cartels do whatever they want and continue with the violence in the rural areas, the violence against social activists. And whereas Petros probably will use all his power in order to stop violence against political activists, against social activists that so far are killed in Colombia very frequently and is one of the most dangerous countries for activists in the world.
But it seems that violence in Colombia hasn't changed the mind of voters. They still have, according to the polls, Duque as first, one of the main connections to Uribe, which is widely connected to paramilitarism for years in Colombia.
Yeah, it is interesting when you look at how voters have decided in Colombia. When more violence is in place, less support that has Uribe. When you look at Chocó, or you look at Cúcuta, or you look, Caquetá, or places where violence takes place and where activists are murdered, or where the president of the state is less strong, those are the places where Uribe do not have the support. Uribe has the support in big cities that are far away from this violence we are talking about. So I think that that also shows the failure of Uribe's policies in order to tackle violence, at the same time a certain level or lack of sensitivity of the Colombian population with those areas that are experiencing violence so far.
And since you've been working in Ecuador for a while now, for 4 years about now, how do you see the situation coming into Ecuador? We've seen how violence has come into Ecuador through the border with recent attacks and bombings and kidnappings happening in Ecuador. How do you see the relationship with either of the candidates winning?
Well, that's actually a very interesting question, since, for example, the so-called Huacho, that is supposed to be a former guerrilla member of FARC, is used actually by Iván Duque and Uribe in order to show that the treaty or the peace treaty accords with the FARC are a failure and that have to be changed their terms. When we see that Huacho left FARC 1 year before the peace treaties, so he is not related at all with the peace treaties or with the failure of the peace treaties. So he has been used, Huacho, as an electoral weapon by Uribe. On the other hand, it's actually how it's affecting the situation in Ecuador is also something to talk about, because this is something completely new. We have never seen before this kind of violence in Ecuadorian territory. It was always something that happened within Colombia's borders. But I think that this is the effect of that new violence, of that new kind of cartel that is acting in our region. Huacho and other cartels or other kind of violence that is happening also within Colombia has to do more with the expansion of the power of the cartels in Mexico and their acts outside their borders of Mexico than with the violence we were used to in Colombia or in our region before, or some years before. So this is something like the cartelization of violence in South America because of due to the power, the increase in power of the cartels of Mexico. So I don't think that it has something to do with the peace treaty or even with the relationship between violence, paramilitarism or guerrillas that were in place up till now. It has to do with the increase in power of narco transnationals in Mexico.
But it also has to do with the strategy that either candidate wins, or what the strategy that they use to cover those areas that were once part of the FARC territory and are now an open target for any violent group.
Sure, because what has happened is that the ineffectiveness of the peace treaty has as a result, backrooms or criminal narcos has occupied those areas and not the state. And of course, this is something that policymakers have to look at, because in a way also the peace accords has not been as effective as they were expected. And probably we'll see a different perspective and acts depending if it's Petro or Ivan Duque who takes power. Probably Ivan Duque will use more strength and force in order to curb violence in those areas. But we will see if it's also selective, because what we saw during Uribe's government was that he put a lot of effort in combating the guerrilla, but at the same time he sort of left the paramilitarism to grow up. So is he going to do the same, Ivan Duque, if he grabs power, if he gets power, with the new narcos, with the new type of violence that are in those areas that were before occupied by the guerrilla? And with Petro, the question is the same. How Petro would tackle this issue? Is he going to use more violence, or is he going to use other strategies, like, for example, more presence of the state, more education, more alternative for the population, not to get into the narco and the guerrillas or the paramilitarism, but to have decent life that will prevent also these paramilitary groups for getting into the lives of that population?
And, well, either of them will have to deal with the situation that Colombia will become a global partner of NATO. Juan Manuel Santos, the Peace Prize winner, announced that that was going to happen. And how will that affect the new relationship with the government of Colombia?
I guess that after the FARC peace agreement took place, there was no meaning or reason for the US to have 7 military bases in Colombia. That will, of course, come to the question that if the US should leave Colombia and leave probably the last country where his military presence was so strong in the whole region. The US has to justify his presence, especially in this moment where they are sort of losing influence in other parts of the world. The last decade also showed that the US was not welcome anymore in the region. So I guess that this move of Juan Manuel Santos at the end of his presidency also is paying back to the US all the support that he has received from this country. At the moment also the US needs to be in South America, needs to be next to Venezuela, a country that continuously has different administration of the US harassed and will continue harassing. And also, in order to control the region, is very good to have a global partner of NATO in the region, and in that sense justify his military presence. So I guess that somehow that's why he decided, Juan Manuel Santos, to do it at the end of his presidency. He has to pay back all the favors he has received from the US, and this is a favor that the US was demanding.
Indeed, a key election for Colombia, and I'm sure it will affect the whole region as well. Thank you very much for your time, Fernando.
Thank you to you.
So we were talking to Fernando Casado, political analyst, about the coming second round of elections in Colombia and how the decisions taken after that will affect Colombia's future. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Carla González. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time. Muchas gracias por el tiempo.